The sign at the edge of the county line was painted in a cheerful, aggressive yellow that seemed to vibrate against the gray overcast sky of rural Ohio. It read, "Welcome to Amaryllis, a week you'll never forget." Elara pulled her sedan onto the gravel shoulder, the engine ticking as it cooled in the humid afternoon air. She checked her watch. It was exactly 4 p.m. on a Sunday. According to the frantic, unfinished letter her sister Sophie had mailed 2 weeks ago, and the subsequent silence that followed, Elara now had exactly 168 hours to find her and get out. She wasn't a detective or a hero. She was a paralegal with a tank full of gas and a heavy knot of dread tightening in her stomach. As she stared at the town nestled in the valley below, it looked suspiciously perfect, a grid of white picket fences and manicured lawns that seemed to have been preserved in amber since 1954. Driving into the heart of Amaryllis felt like entering a movie set. The people on the sidewalks moved with a synchronized grace, nodding to one another with wide, practiced smiles. Elara checked into the Hearthside Inn, a grand Victorian structure that smelled of lavender and floor wax. The woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Gable, possessed skin that was unnervingly smooth, stretched tight over her cheekbones like vacuum-sealed plastic. When Elara slid a photograph of Sophie across the mahogany counter, Mrs. Gable didn't even lean in to look. She simply smiled, her eyes remaining fixed and unblinking. She told Elara that Sophie had been a lovely guest, but that everyone in Amaryllis eventually moved on to greater things by the end of their stay. It was a cryptic remark delivered with the casualness of a weather report, and it sent a cold shiver down Elara's spine. By Tuesday, the unease had settled into Elara's marrow. She spent her days scouring the town, but the more she looked, the more the demographic of Amaryllis disturbed her. There were men of all ages, shopkeepers, gardeners, and mailmen, but the women were an anomaly. Every woman she saw was young, vibrant, and looked like she had arrived yesterday. There were no elderly women, no middle-aged mothers, and no young girls playing in the streets. When she visited the local archives to look for property records or missing persons reports, she found the ledgers were a chaotic mess of ink. Every week, a new list of female names was entered, and every week, the previous names were struck through with a single heavy line of black ink. They weren't recorded as dead or moved. They simply ceased to be listed. The architecture of the town began to fascinate and repulse her in equal measure. Overnight, a new fountain had appeared in the center of the town square. It featured a statue of a woman kneeling in prayer, her face twisted in a look of profound, silent grief. Elara walked up to it, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the stone. The surface wasn't cold like granite or marble. It felt warm, almost humming with a low-frequency vibration. Under the morning sun, she could see the fine details of the statue, the individual pores in the skin, the tiny jagged lines of a fingernail, and the way a single stone tear seemed to be emerging from a duct. It wasn't a carving, it was a capture. Elara pulled her hand back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. On Thursday morning, the physical symptoms began. Elara woke up feeling a strange, heavy resistance in her limbs. When she tried to sit up, her joints creaked with a sound like grinding gravel. She rushed to the bathroom mirror and gasped. Her skin was losing its healthy glow, turning a dull matte ivory that looked like unpolished porcelain. She tried to pinch the skin on her forearm, but her fingers couldn't gain purchase. The flesh was becoming dense and rigid. Panic surged through her, and she ran to the local clinic, a small, sterile building manned by a Dr. Reese. The doctor didn't seem surprised to see her. He checked his pocket watch with a clinical detachment and remarked that she was actually ahead of schedule, noting that the hardening usually didn't reach the torso. Until the sixth day, Dr. Aris explained the truth with a terrifying calm pride. He told Elara that Amaryllis was a masterpiece of human will, but that even masterpieces required maintenance against the rod of entropy. The founders had discovered that the town's beauty and structural integrity could be maintained through a process of biological conversion. They didn't use lumber, clay, or steel to build their monuments. They used the will and essence of the young women who passed through. The town was a living, parasitic organism that consumed the biological and replaced it with the eternal. The women didn't leave, and they didn't die. They became the town itself. They were the pillars of the library, the cobblestones of the high street, and the ornamental statues in the gardens. They were the foundation upon which the men of Amaryllis lived their timeless, perfect lives. Terror-stricken, Elara fled the clinic and scrambled into her car. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, her legs moving with the stiff mechanical motion of a puppet. She slammed the car into gear and floored it toward the county line, desperate to reach the yellow sign that marked the exit. She drove for miles, the speedometer climbing, but the scenery never changed. Every turn led her back to the town square. The geography of Amaryllis had folded in on itself, creating a topological loop that allowed no escape. No matter how fast she drove, she would eventually see the same fountain, the same praying statue, and the same smiling men tipping their hats to her as she sped past in a futile race against her own petrification. By Friday night, Elara's hands had fused to the steering wheel. It wasn't a chemical bond, but a cellular transition. Her skin was now a polished, speckled marble, and she could no longer feel her pulse. She didn't need to breathe. The air felt like an unnecessary intrusion on her newfound density. She managed to haul herself out of the car, her footsteps sounding like heavy mallets striking the pavement. She staggered toward the new wing of the town hall, which was still under construction. She saw other women there, some already halfway turned into columns, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal silent screams. Among them, she saw a familiar face, a woman who had been turned into a decorative lintel above the main door. It was Sophie. Her sister's eyes were wide and filled with a conscious, living horror, but her lips were forever sealed in stone. Sunday morning arrived with a cruel golden sun. It was 4 p.m., exactly 1 week since Elara had crossed the border. The townspeople gathered in a square for the weekly Founders' Gala. The men wore their finest suits, and the newest arrivals, the girls who had only been in town for a day, watched the festivities with confused, bright-eyed smiles, unaware that their own internal clocks were already ticking toward stasis. Mrs. Gable approached Elara, who was now standing perfectly still at the entrance of the park. Elara was no longer a person. She had been designated as an ornamental gatepost. She was fully conscious, a prisoner within a body of unbreakable mineral. She could feel the wind on her surface and the heat of the sun, but she could not blink, could not scream, and could not die. As the sun began to set, the workmen arrived with buckets of wax and polishing cloths. They treated Elara with the same care a museum curator would give a priceless artifact. They buffed her marble shoulders and polished the stone folds of her dress until she shone under the street lamps. One of the men leaned his ladder against her ribs to reach the top of her head, and though she felt the pressure, there was no pain, only a deep, vibrating resonance that echoed through her heavy, silent core. She realized then that the rumors were wrong. The women didn't disappear after a week. They simply stopped being seen as human. They became the scenery, the background noise to a town that refused to age. The story ended as it always did. A new car pulled up to the yellow sign at the edge of the county line. A young woman, perhaps looking for a sister or just a quiet place to stay, stepped out and looked at the town of Amaryllis with a hopeful expression. From her vantage point as a gatepost, Elara watched as the town opened its beautiful, hungry mouth to welcome its newest brick. The girl walked forward, her heels clicking on the cobblestones that had once been women just like her, and the cycle began again. Elara wanted to shout a warning, to tell her to run before the stiffness set in, but all she could do was stand there, a silent, beautiful monument to a week she would truly never forget. Would you like me to explore what happens when the next girl discovers a hidden message carved into Elara's stone skin? The fuel light on the dashboard of Clara's SUV had been glowing a steady, taunting amber for nearly 20 miles before the fog-choked silhouette of Oak Haven finally appeared. Nestled in a deep-shadowed valley of the Oregon wilderness, the town felt like a secret the mountains had tried to swallow. There was no mention of it on her GPS, and the paper map she picked up at a rest stop 2 hours back showed only a blank green expanse of national forest. But as the engine began to sputter, the neon sign of a gas station flickered through the mist like a lighthouse. Clara rolled into the station, the silence of the valley so profound it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against the glass of her windshield. She stepped out into the damp air, the scent of pine and rotting leaves filling her lungs, and noticed that the town was unnervingly quiet for 7 o'clock on a Friday evening. Inside the station's small convenience store, the bell above the door gave a lonely metallic chime. A woman behind the counter was stocking shelves with jars of honey that looked dark, almost like clotted blood. She turned to look at Clara, and for a moment, Clara forgot to breathe. The woman was beautiful, but her skin possessed a translucent, sickly quality, and her eyes were a flat, milky hazel. When Clara asked for a fill-up and directions to the main highway, the woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and touched Clara's hand with fingers that felt like damp marble. She told Clara that the highway was gone for the season and that she should head to the Evergreen Inn down the street. Her voice was a low melodic drone that seemed to vibrate in Clara's teeth. "The ground here doesn't like to let go of new things," the woman whispered, her gaze drifting down to Clara's boots. Shaken, Clara paid for her gas and hurried back to her car. She didn't go to the inn. She went back the way she came. She drove for 30 minutes, her eyes locked on the dark ribbon of asphalt, but the road never climbed out of the valley. Instead, it banked sharply to the left, and before she could process the geography, she was staring at the neon sign of the gas station again. Panic, sharp and cold, flared in her chest. She turned the car around and drove faster, the needle hitting 70 on the narrow road. 10 minutes later, the gas station appeared again, the same woman standing in the window, watching her with that same unblinking stare. The road wasn't a loop. The town was a sinkhole, a topographical anomaly that seemed to pull everything back to its center. She eventually gave in to the exhaustion and checked into the Evergreen Inn. The manager, a man with a jovial, terrifyingly wise smile named Mr. Thorne, took her credit card without looking at it. He told her she was lucky to have arrived during the Binding, a local festival she had never heard of. As Clara walked to her room, she saw other women in the hallway. They were all dressed in flowing, earth-toned gowns, moving with a heavy, sluggish grace. One woman was leaning against the wall, her hands pressed flat against the wallpaper. Clara noticed, with a jolt of horror, that the woman's fingernails seemed to be merging with the floral pattern, fine green filaments growing out from under her cuticles and stitching her flesh to the lath and plaster. The woman looked at Clara, her mouth opening to speak, but only a thick amber-colored sap leaked from her lips. Clara locked her door and pushed the heavy oak dresser in front of it. She sat on the edge of the bed, her heart hammering, and tried to call for help. but her phone showed a no service message that felt like a death sentence. As the night deepened, she felt a strange itching sensation in the soles of her feet. She pulled off her socks and screamed. Thin, white rootlets, no thicker than sewing thread, were erupting from her pores, reaching downward toward the floorboards. She tried to brush them away, but they were firm, already weaving themselves into the fibers of the rug. The pain was dull and rhythmic, like a second heartbeat thrumming in the floor. She realized then that the town didn't keep women captive with locks or guards. It kept them by making them a part of its biology. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, Clara grabbed a pocket knife from her bag and began to frantically hack at the roots. Each cut sent a jolt of lightning through her nervous system, a scream tearing from her throat that sounded like a branch snapping in a storm. She managed to sever the connections, but the floor groaned in response. The entire building seemed to shudder, the wooden walls pulsing like a giant lung. She scrambled out the window, dropping onto the damp earth of the garden below. The moment her bare skin touched the soil, the ground seemed to wake up. The grass curled around her ankles like grasping fingers, and the trees overhead dipped their branches, their leaves whispering her name in a chorus of dry, rustling voices. She ran toward the edge of town, her feet bleeding as she tore them away from the earth with every step. She saw the gardeners, the men of Oakhaven, patrolling the perimeter with long, sharp shears. They weren't looking for intruders. They were pruning. She hid behind a large stone fountain and watched as they approached a woman who had tried to flee an hour before. The woman was now waist-deep in the dirt, her legs having fused into a single bark-covered trunk. The men moved with a terrifying ritualistic efficiency, trimming the leaves that were sprouting from her hair and whispering words of encouragement to the weeping wooden thing that had once been a person. "The soil is hungry, Eleanor," one of them said. "You're doing so well for the community." The true horror hit Clara as she realized the ecology of the place. The men provided the labor and the maintenance, but the women were the literal foundation of the town's existence. Their bodies were processed into the infrastructure, their nervous systems expanded to form the town's power grid. Their life force used to keep the valley lush and hidden from the outside world. The houses were grown, not built, and every beam and floorboard was made of sentient, suffering tissue. The mother of the town was the ancient willow in the square, a colossal tree whose roots spanned the entire valley, connecting every woman in Oakhaven into a single, agonizing collective consciousness. Clara could feel it now, a low hum in the back of her brain, 1,000 voices crying out for water, for light, for an end. She reached the edge of the valley where the road should have been, but in its place stood a wall of thorns, so dense and high it blocked out the moon. She tried to climb, but the thorns were like needles, injecting a numbing venom into her veins. Her legs felt heavy, turning to lead, and she collapsed to her knees. The ground beneath her softened, turning to a thick, black muck that began to swallow her calves. She looked up and saw Mr. Thorne standing at the edge of the thorns, holding a watering can and a silver spade. He looked at her with a fatherly sort of pity. "It's no use, Clara," he said softly. "You have such a strong spirit. You'll make a wonderful support beam for the new library. We've been needing the extra stability." As the numbing sensation spread to her hips, Clara's vision began to shift. She was no longer seeing through her eyes. She was seeing through the grass, through the wind in the trees, through the very stones of the street. She felt the woman in the gas station, her roots deep in the fuel tanks. She felt Sarah at the inn, her spine becoming the staircase. She felt the agonizing weight of the town pressing down on her, and for the first time, the silence of Oakhaven made sense. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the sound of 1,000 women holding their breath so they wouldn't scream. Her skin began to harden, the texture shifting from flesh to a polished, nutty grain. In her final moments of mobility, Clara reached out and grabbed a handful of the black soil. She didn't try to fight it anymore. She realized that the only way out was through the system. She began to push her consciousness into the roots, searching for the mother tree, for the central node of this living nightmare. If she was to be a part of the town, she wouldn't be a victim. She would be a cancer. She felt the mother tree's ancient, bloated heart beating deep beneath the square, and she poured all her hatred, all her fire, into the connection. The ground heaved, a fissure opening in the main street as the collective consciousness of Oakhaven felt a spark of rebellion. But the town was old, and it had dealt with fire before. The roots tightened, wrapping around Clara's heart and squeezing until her thoughts turned to sap. Her scream was the last thing to go, a high piercing whistle that sounded like the wind through a keyhole. By dawn, the SUV was gone, recycled into the scrap metal that reinforced the general store. A new park bench stood at the edge of the woods, its wood unusually warm to the touch and its grain swirling in a pattern that looked remarkably like a human face in mid-shout. The next time a car rolled into the valley on fumes, Clara would be the first thing the driver sat on to rest her tired legs, never knowing that the wood beneath her was weeping. Would you like me to write an epilogue from the perspective of the next woman to arrive, who hears Clara's voice in the creaking of the floorboards? Riley drove because the silence in her apartment had become a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made the rafters groan and the air feel used. It was 3 in the morning in the high flat stretches of eastern Wyoming, a place where the horizon was merely a suggestion and the stars felt like cold, distant spectators. She had been on the road for 6 hours, fueled by cheap gas station coffee and the desperate need to be anywhere else. The GPS on her dashboard had flickered out miles ago, leaving her with nothing but the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt and the hypnotic dance of her headlights. The road should have been empty, a straight line through the sagebrush and dust, but as she crested a gentle rise, the world changed. A cluster of lights appeared in the distance, amber and flickering like a dying fire. There was no exit sign, no warning, just a sudden, impossible main street that bled out of the darkness. The town was called Silence, or at least that's what the rusted iron archway arching over the road claimed. Riley slowed her car, her foot hovering over the brake as she rolled past the first few buildings. The architecture was a jarring patchwork of era's Victorian houses with sagging porches sat beside neon-lit diners that looked like they belonged in a 1950s postcard, all of them coated in a fine gray dust that looked like ash. She pulled over in front of a cinema whose marquee was blank, the glass of the ticket booth cracked in a spiderweb pattern. She checked her phone. There was no signal, and the clock had stopped at 3:14 a.m. A surge of unease, sharp and cold, pricked at her skin. She wasn't supposed to be here. This space was supposed to be empty desert. She reached for the door handle, her curiosity warring with a primal instinct to floor the gas and never look back. But the silence of the town was different from the silence of her apartment. It wasn't empty. It was expectant. Stepping out of the car, Riley felt the air turn heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and old, wet paper. She walked toward a diner named The Solitary Plate, its windows glowing with a soft, sickly yellow light. Inside, the booths were empty, but the smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee was overwhelming. A man sat behind the counter, his back to her. He was wearing a grease-stained apron, his shoulders hunched as if he were bracing for a blow. Riley cleared her throat, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the still air. She asked for directions, her voice sounding thin and alien to her own ears. The man didn't turn, He didn't even move. It was only when Riley took a step closer that she noticed the reflection in the polished chrome of a napkin holder. The man had no face. Where eyes and a mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too small for his frame. Panic finally took hold, a cold flood in her veins. She backed out of the diner, her heels clicking rhythmically on the linoleum. When she burst back onto the street, the town had shifted. The cinema was now a boarded-up church, its steeple leaning at an impossible drunken angle. The streetlights flickered in a sequence that felt like a heartbeat, and the dust on the ground began to swirl into small, purposeful eddies. She scrambled back to her car, fumbling with her keys, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She looked into her rearview mirror to back out, and that was when the true nature of the town revealed itself. In the mirror, there was no town. There were no buildings, no streetlights, no faceless men. There was only the empty, dark desert and her car sitting in the middle of a dirt track that led nowhere. She looked out the side window. The town was there, solid and terrifying. She looked back at the mirror emptiness. She realized then, with a soul-deep dread, that the town didn't exist in the physical world. It was a perceptual parasite, a hallucination made of stone and shadow that only manifested when a human mind was isolated and to be vulnerable. It was a place for the lonely, built by the lonely, and it fed on the observation of a single pair of eyes. She realized that if she could just see another person, a real person, the town would vanish. But she was miles from the nearest soul, trapped in the blind spot of the universe. She slammed the car into drive and floored it, but the road seemed to stretch and warp beneath her tires. The faster she drove, the more the town grew, sprawling out to meet her, its buildings closing in like teeth. She saw them then, the other residents. They weren't in the buildings. They were the buildings. She passed a house where a woman's face was faintly visible in the grain of the wooden siding, her eyes wide and staring, her mouth a knothole frozen in a silent plea. A fence was made of long, pale fingers, the nails sharpened into pickets. The town was a collection of everyone who had ever been truly alone on this stretch of road, their bodies and souls processed into the infrastructure of a nightmare. Riley screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy velvet atmosphere. She wasn't just in a town. She was inside a digestive system. The car's engine began to sputter, the metal of the hood turning soft and porous, looking more like gray flesh than steel. In a moment of pure, white-hot desperation, Riley remembered her dashboard camera. It was a cheap, battery-operated thing she'd bought for insurance purposes. She grabbed it, her fingers fumbling with the power button. The small LCD screen hummed to life, glowing with a digital blue light. She pointed the lens out the windshield. On the tiny screen, the road was empty. The desert was bare. There was nothing but the dark, dusty track and the sagebrush. She stared at the screen, forcing her brain to prioritize the digital truth over the sensory lie. She drove looking only at the 3-inch monitor, her eyes locked onto the grainy, black and white image of the empty road. Outside the windows, she could hear the buildings screaming, the sound of stone grinding against stone, and the wet, slapping sound of the faceless men running alongside her car, trying to catch her attention. "Don't look," she whispered to herself, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's not there. It's only there if you look." The town began to thrash, sensing its prey was slipping away. The buildings leaned in so far they blocked out the stars, their chimneys reaching down like claws to scrape against the roof of her car. She felt the car jolt as it hit a pothole that felt suspiciously like a ribcage. The faceless man from the diner appeared directly in front of the car, his smooth head pressed against the glass of the windshield. His hands, which were nothing but fleshy stumps beating a frantic, silent rhythm against the glass. Riley didn't blink. She kept her eyes glued to the camera screen, watching the digital representation of a clear, open path. She drove through the man as if he were mist, feeling only a slight, sickening resistance. Slowly, the sounds began to fade. The smell of ozone was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of cold desert air. The weight on the car lifted. Riley didn't look up until the camera screen showed the distant, glowing sign of a 24-hour truck stop. She drove until she was under the bright, buzzing fluorescent lights of the gas station, surrounded by idling semi-trucks and the beautiful, mundane sight of a tired trucker cleaning his windshield. She sat in her car for an hour, shaking so violently that she couldn't turn off the ignition. She was safe. She was back in the world of the living, the world of the seen. She eventually gathered the courage to walk into the station, buying a bottle of water just to hear the cashier complain about his shift. Every word was music. She drove the rest of the way home in a trance, never letting the radio stay silent, calling her mother just to hear a voice on the other end. She reached her apartment in the city, the hallways filled with the sounds of neighbors, the hum of the elevator, and the distant sirens of the street. She locked her door, leaned against it, and wept with relief. But as the sun began to set, a new kind of terror took root. She went to the bathroom to splash water on her face, and as she looked into the mirror, she saw the reflection of her hallway behind her. It was empty, just as it should be. But when she turned her head to look at the hallway directly, it wasn't her apartment anymore. Standing in the corner of her eye, just at the edge of her peripheral vision, was a flickering amber streetlight. She turned her head fully, and the hallway was normal. But the moment she looked away, the gray ashen dust began to settle on her carpet. The town hadn't stayed in Wyoming. It had realized that she was this perfect observer. It didn't need a desert anymore. It only needed her to be alone. Now, whenever Riley is in a room by herself, the walls begin to sweat. When she's in the shower, she hears the distant sound of a cinema marquee flickering. The horror isn't that the town appears when you're alone. It's that once you've seen it, you can never truly be alone again. Because the town is always there, waiting in the parts of the world you aren't looking at. She lives now in a state of constant, frantic socialization, terrified of the day she has to close her eyes to sleep, knowing that when she wakes up, she might find her bedroom has finally become a permanent resident of silence. Would you like me to write a sequel where Riley tries to find others who have seen the town to create a collective site that can destroy it?